All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to tackle a really tough but super important question, drawing on the thought of Maulana Wahiddin Khan. And the question is this: why has a century of incredible sacrifice led to so little progress for so many in the Muslim community? I mean, that's a heavy question, right? For over 100 years, we've seen immense sacrifices, people giving their lives, their property, their energy. But when you step back and look at the real, tangible, positive results, something just doesn't add up. Why so much effort for such minimal progress? Well, to figure that out, we've got to look at the patterns of the past. So before we can even get to the root cause, we have to look at the symptoms. What has this problem actually looked like on the ground for the last several decades? Well, the picture that emerges is one of huge sacrifice, but also stagnation. The go-to approach for complex, modern problems has often been to issue a religious edict, a fatwa, as the first move. But here's the catch. This often happens without a deep dive into what the problem really is. And the result? You get stuck in a cycle of conflict, doing the same things over and over again, even when they clearly don't work, without ever stopping to ask that crucial question. Hey, why isn't this working? So what's really going on here? The source material we're looking at argues that it's not a lack of sincerity or passion. Not at all. The real issue is much deeper. It's about the mindset. And it really boils down to a choice. A choice between two totally different ways of approaching the world. And this is where it gets super interesting. Check this out. On one side, you've got the reactive path. This is described as being almost instinctual, animalistic. It's all emotion, a gut feeling that requires zero deep thought. And where does it lead? Almost always to conflict. And crucially, the source says it doesn't attract divine help. But then there's the reflective path. This is what makes us human. It's about using our intellect, about planning, about really understanding a situation. And that is what sparks creative solutions. And you guessed it, this is the path that's said to attract God's help. Okay, so if the problem is this reactive mindset, what's the cure? Well, the answer proposed here is pretty profound. It's about going back to the absolute core of faith itself. And let me be clear, this is not about finding a new faith. It's about rediscovering the one that's already there. Now, this verse from the Quran might make you pause for a second. O you who have believed, believe? Wait, what? It almost sounds like a contradiction, right? But it's not. It's actually an incredibly powerful call to action. It's telling us that belief isn't a one-and-done deal. It's a continuous, dynamic process, something you have to renew and rediscover every single day. And this is what the source calls a living faith. Think of it like a plant, not a rock. A rock is static. It just sits there. A plant has to be watered. It has to grow and adapt. It's an active thinking process, not some dusty label you inherit. It means you're constantly engaged with scripture, the prophet's example, and the world around you, always trying to keep your understanding fresh, relevant, and creative. And look what happens when that faith becomes a rock instead of a plant. You get this downward spiral. If you stop rediscovering your faith, your thinking gets stiff and rigid. And what happens when things get rigid? Creativity just dies. And once that creative spark is gone, how can a community possibly deal with new problems or fulfill its purpose? It can't. Okay, so this whole idea of a living faith sounds great, but what does it actually look like in the real world? When faced with a problem, what does a person with this mindset actually do? Well, instead of just lashing out emotionally, the creative believer has a game plan. It's a clear 4-step process. First, they look at the situation for what it is, objectively, no drama. Second, they try to understand it through the timeless principles of the Quran. Third, they make a realistic plan based on the results they actually want to achieve. And only then, as the very last step, do they take considered, thoughtful action. And that's the whole ballgame right there. It's all about that pause, the space between what happens to you and how you respond. That little gap is where all the magic happens. It's where thought, planning, and wisdom live. See, a reaction is automatic, like a reflex, but a response is something you choose. So, if the solution is that clear, to think, plan, and then act, why doesn't it happen more often? What's the big roadblock? Well, the source points to one massive psychological barrier that gets in the way. It comes down to one word: pride. The moment faith stops being a path to humility and a connection with God, and instead becomes a tool to feel superior to other people, it just becomes a source of conflict. This pride-based identity, which the source even calls a state of jahiliyat, linking it to a pre-Islamic age of ignorance, completely blocks the entire purpose of faith, which is supposed to be about cultivating love and goodwill. And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? The point of faith is not to make people fight. It's to make people love God's creation. A mindset based on pride is fundamentally completely incompatible with that goal. They're like oil and water. All right, so let's pull all these threads together. We've diagnosed the problem, we've identified the cure, and we've spotted the main barrier. Now we can lay out a super clear, actionable formula for what revival actually looks like. What it really boils down to is a fundamental shift in mindset across the board. You're trading the old path for the new path. So you're moving from reaction to reflection, from pride to humility, from just issuing a fatwa to genuine understanding and planning. You're swapping conflict for goodwill and prayer. You're replacing raw emotion with real wisdom. And ultimately, you're upgrading that static inherited faith to a living, creative faith. It's a total transformation. And let's be very clear, this entire framework isn't some new age invention. It's rooted in the core practice, the sunnah of the Prophet himself. This hadith tells us that he was in a constant state of deep and serious thinking. Think about that for a second. It wasn't just an occasional activity for him. It was his way of being. And that leaves us with this one final, powerful idea to reflect on. Engaging our intellect, thinking, planning, and considering, isn't something separate from faith. In fact, it might just be one of its highest and most important expressions.